All right, before we jump into this one, I just have to say, because I already know some of you are coming in hot, ready to fight. So what I'm not saying in this video is I'm not saying that God cannot speak to people. I believe he can, and I even believe God can speak to somebody about who their spouse is. And my hope would be if somebody's a Christian, they're actually praying about and seeking God's will for their dating and marriage life and trying to hear God. So I'm not saying any of that. But what I am saying is, I think even with knowing or feeling strongly that God has told us something, there can be some real concerns that come with it, because I think when we hear or feel one thing, we start shutting off wisdom and other things. That's what I'm trying to get at in this video. So with that disclaimer in mind, here's the deal. Having served in pastoral ministry for 15 years and having counseled couples for over a decade, it's probably safe to say I've seen, I think, some of the greatest stories of God's redemption and grace in people's lives. I've also seen some of the depths of depravity of Christians struggling with sin and flesh issues in this process called sanctification. I think Paul probably says it best in Romans 7 when he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do, but what I hate, I do. And then he goes on to say in verses 22 and 23, for in my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. Then in verse 25, he says, so then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to sin. So what is he saying in all that? Here's my conclusion, and here's what I've witnessed. I believe there are a lot of Christians who genuinely desire God and also genuinely desire a person to marry. And at times, it can be difficult to tell whether those two desires are working together or they're not. I think if people are honest with themselves, it can be difficult to know how exactly to navigate the spiritual aspect of dating and relationship. And so I've seen many people over the years sit in my office and tell me that God told them this was their person. I've seen people come in, do premarital counseling, tell me the story. I always ask for the love story. Tell me their love story about how the first time I saw them, God dropped something in my spirit. God told me the first time we saw each other, we knew this was the person that God had purposed for us, on and on and on, only to be 2 years later divorcing that person. So then the question is, what happened? Did they not hear from God? Is it just something they wanted, and in their own mind they convinced themselves it was God? Is it maybe something that God actually did tell them? But what they didn't realize is that God was telling them to marry that person not for their own happiness and good, but to be part of that person's healing process, and they didn't want to go through that? Or did they overestimate their spiritual maturity? And God did tell them, but they weren't willing to do the tough work that it takes in relationship, the pick up your cross daily. They didn't want to do some of that stuff. It could be a variety of things. There's probably more questions than answers around that. But when I see that happening, it gives me a little pause and makes me go, okay, maybe there's more to this whole relationship thing than simply God told me and let me run after it full speed ahead. So again, what I'm not saying, I said this at the start, I'm going to say it again because some of you are ready to just fire off. I'm not saying God cannot tell somebody about their spouse. What I am saying is, if they are hearing God that clearly about the person that they're supposed to date and marry, I would also assume that they're hearing God clearly on some other areas of their life. So if somebody ever comes to you and says, God told me you were the one, my first response back to them would be, and should be for you, awesome. Hopefully he'll confirm that with me as well. But in the meantime, can you give me 2 or 3 other instances in the last couple of years where God clearly spoke to you, you walked in obedience, and it was confirmed that was him? Because there should be a track record. Otherwise, it seems a little weird, like this person doesn't really hear God clearly on anything else, but all of a sudden on this, they hear God with abundant clarity. I know some people who are clearly not living their lives for God in so many other areas of their lives. They're not walking in obedience just to what the word says, but somehow God drops in their spirit who they're supposed to marry with absolute clarity, even though they're not listening or hearing him in other areas. That would cause me pause. So, I'm not saying God can't speak to you about your spouse. I would hope that he is, and I would hope that you're praying, and I would hope that you're using wisdom. But in that strategy, if you're saying God told me, if the other person's saying God told me, let me give you 5 concerns that I have that can show up even if it is legitimately God who told you. Concern number 1 is that you will have a tendency to overlook legitimate red flags. So you may see things in a relationship and you go, that's a red flag, or I don't know about that. And we'll have a tendency to minimize them, to ignore them, to overlook them, because after all, God told us. So then our assumption is, if God told us, then maybe I can ignore these because God will clearly work it out. But God didn't tell you this is the person and here are the red flags and don't worry about it, I got them. Most of the time he just told you that's the person. And your tendency is, well, I'm going to overlook these red flags. There may be things that you see that you know you can't live within a relationship. There may be things that you see that are toxic, dysfunctional, unhealthy, and not Christ-like in a relationship with this person. But we have a tendency to overlook it because in our mind, we're like, well, shoot, God will work it out. So what I would say to you is, number 1, God will not force anybody to do anything. God doesn't force us to change. He gives us opportunities to change, and we have to step in and decide to do it. Number 2, you can never change a person. So if you don't address these flags now and see if they have a willingness to adjust and change, you got no guarantee they're going to be willing to do it later. So what I would say to you is address the red flags, even if God told you, address the red flags you see now before marriage, rather than assuming we're going to get married and then God's going to work it out on the back end. Because God will not force them to do anything they don't want to do. So, just because God told you does not mean it would be wise to overlook red flags, and I see that happening a lot. Concern number 2 is we have a tendency to speed up the process, right? Because after all, we're confident that this is the person that God has for us. So if we're confident this is God who God has for us, let's go ahead and hurry up and get married. Why would we want to delay something that God has for us, right? And then we can even, if we're really spiritual, we can start grabbing verses out of context and say, well, Paul says it's better to marry than burn. So, we don't want to, we're really feeling each other. We want to get married so we can honor God, which is a weird paradox because a lot of times people are not honoring God by marrying somebody and making unwise decisions and not really getting to know them. That's a whole different idea. But we've got to spend time with somebody to know somebody. Healthy relationships come out of talk, togetherness, and time. And if that's lopsided, if we have too much talk, like long distance relationship, we feel like we really know each other a whole bunch, but we've got no togetherness and no time, that puts us in an awkward position. You got people who do a whole bunch of stuff together. We travel together and we go out to eat and all this stuff. No depth of talk, and it hadn't been very long, but I feel like I know this person. There is no substitute for time. You only get to know somebody's patterns over time. You need to see them in different seasons. Research even shows this, that couples who date 2 years or more, depending on which research statistics you look at, have a lower divorce rate than couples who date less than 2 years. Anywhere from 20 to 50% lower divorce rate for couples who take 2 years or more to date before marriage. Here's what I would say to you. If you are so confident that this is God's person for you and God told you, or they said God told them you were the one, slow it down. Why be in a hurry? If this is God's idea and it's God's ordained, nothing's going to get in the way of it. You don't have to worry about anybody else sneaking in the back door if you take too long. You don't have to worry about frustrations happening. If you both believe it's God, why not slow it down and take time? We already know God has called it. He's going to work it out. So I would say people who are confident God has told them should be people that go even slower, not people that speed it up. But my concern is I see a lot of people who feel like it's God, speed it up, and they run into something they really don't know what they're running into. A third concern I have is that you often have a tendency to over-spiritualize your interactions. So I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that you see what you're looking for, or if you're familiar with confirmation bias, it just says that we favor information that strengthens the beliefs we already have about something. That happens all the time when you already believe God's told you this a person. Now you start seeing signs from God everywhere. Ooh, that was God. That was God. I had never told him about that thing. I never told him I liked that thing, and they totally did it. That must have been God. Or we don't remember everything we say, so maybe you had told them before you liked it. They just remembered it and they did it. Or maybe they just like doing it, and so it's easy for them. They do what they like, and it just happened to be something you like, right? Or you say, ooh, that was totally a sign from God because that was on my list. And they didn't know what was on my list, and they totally did it or are it, so that must be God because it was on my list, right? And so if we're going to spiritualize things, then we also have to recognize that we live in a spiritual world where there's good and evil, right? The Bible says that the devil masquerades as an angel of light. So is it possible that this person is masquerading as an angel of light? They're really sent by the enemy, not by God. And maybe the devil saw your list that you have too, and this person came in. You see where I'm going? I know I'm being facetious and I'm going some places, but if we're going to say that I have this list and because they did it, it must have been God, it is also possible that someone else got a hold of your list and they got sent in with a wrong mindset and a wrong motive to disrupt this thing. But when we're convinced it's God, we start seeing God in everything because that's what we want to see. And I promise you, I have sat with people who told me time after time, oh, this was a sign. They were convinced sign after sign after sign after sign that this was a person. And 3 years later, they are telling me that God gave them signs that they should leave legitimately with a straight face. Yeah, it's been rough and I've been praying and then God showed me this and then God showed me this. And I think it's a sign he wants me to leave. Well, one of those times you're not seeing the right sign because God did not give you signs to get into it and then turn around 3 years later and give you signs to get out of it. So something got missed in there. But what happens is we begin to over-spiritualize all our interactions because we want it to fit with the narrative that we believe that God told us. And again, he may have. But it causes us to start looking at things through that lens instead of looking at those things with wisdom. So we've got to be careful. That's a concern. A fourth concern I have is that a lot of Christians tend to overestimate their spiritual maturity. And I see this a lot of times with people who have not prioritized God in their dating relationships, and they've been with people who didn't share the same faith or different stuff, or they weren't living it out. And so when they get to a place they want to prioritize that, kind of all they're looking for, the primary thing they're looking for, is that, oh, this person loves God too. So if this person loves God and I love God, my gosh, this could be a fantastic relationship, because in the past ones, I liked God, they didn't, it didn't work out. So really they feel like this one thing, their shared value of faith, is going to be the thing that can get them through it. And then there's a lot of scriptures that would cause us to believe that we can do anything through Christ who strengthens us, right? that we can put others' interest in front of our own and not think of ourselves. And there's a lot of scriptural support for us to be able to endure things with God's strength that we wouldn't be able to do in our own strength. And that's true. But I think a lot of people start then taking that and going into marriage where there's a lot of issues in the relationship, or there's a lot of concerns with the other person, or frankly, there's just stuff about the other person that bugs you. It's not spiritual, it's just regular, right? We all have pet peeves. We all have likes and dislikes. If there's something you have a real pet peeve, for instance, let's say you have a real pet peeve with loud chewers. And this person is great everywhere else, but man, they chew loud and they chew with their mouth open. But you think to yourself, come on, man, that's such a small thing, and that's not spiritual. That's just like superficial, and I shouldn't put that on my list. And someone told you to scratch your list because lists aren't of God, and you got to trust God, and however you got here, you go, yeah, I can deal with it. But you got to look at the reality that that's 3 meals a day, every day, for the rest of your life. You have to listen to loud chewer. That's when you're on anniversary vacation, sitting across the table from them, the waves crashing, romantic candlelight, and loud chewer is right there. So you start ordering soup and soft foods so you don't have to hear them, right? I mean, again, Relationship is not all about that stuff, but here's what I do know. If you've got enough of those little things in relationship that bug you, like, just different interests and pet peeves and little quirks and other stuff, and well, I'm not super attracted to them, but they love Jesus and stuff like that. That means every day you've got to get up and jump over those hurdles to be in a relationship with that person. I used to always tell singles or pre-married really in our premarital classes, listen, I want you to be able to marry that person next to you in your flesh. God's not even a part of this. Like, you like them, you got common interests, you got shared values, all the stuff that makes a relationship. And then when we add our faith, then when we add the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, then imagine the kind of relationship we could have. But I think a lot of people go into marriage overestimating, God will help me endure that. God can see me through that. God can change them. God. And they don't realize that I have seen many, many times in counseling, people who love Jesus in great pain relationally, oftentimes their pain will trump their theology or their spiritual maturity. I know this isn't God's best, but I don't like how I'm feeling, and so I'm making a decision primarily based on my pain and my feelings, not on what I believe to be God's best. So I see people who believe God told them, now overestimating their spiritual maturity. Oh man, we both love Jesus. That means we can both endure. Yeah, maybe, but are you honestly walking in the Spirit 100% of your life? Because if you're not, there may be some things that become a struggle for you along the process. A fifth concern I have for you is that when you think God told you this is the one, you often discount your community. Now, some of you don't have community, and that's a whole different idea and a whole different video. I believe dating and marriage are group projects. Believe you need good people around you. But oftentimes, if you've got good community around you and you're dating, they should be a part of your dating process. They should be a part of your dating decisions, because they're going to see stuff you don't see because they're not wrapped into this thing emotionally, which is why we need good people around us, because we may be ignoring or missing something that they clearly see and they're like, So if you have good community, you better listen to good community. I don't care how lonely you are. I don't care how much you're feeling this person. I don't care how much you want to be in a relationship. I don't care how much you think God told you. If the people that you believe God has placed around you that are your friends, that love you, that love Jesus, want what's best for you, if they have a check in their spirit, if they don't feel good about this, if they think this person is not good for you, that should be enough. That should be more important than how you're feeling in the moment. But when you believe God told you, or when the other person says God told them you were the one, we often can discount our community, because now we're thinking, well, God's voice is more important than their voice. And yes, ultimately God's voice is more important, but God also speaks through people, and God also surrounds us with people, and we're supposed to use wisdom, and we're supposed to have a multitude of counsel to help us walk out and make decisions in relationships. So I've seen many times where someone feels strongly God told them, and they stop listening to the people around them that are showing concerns about this relationship. Even if God told you, God should be confirming it in the people around you. That's one of the questions I often ask in premarital is, how do your family and friends feel about this person? Do they like them? Are they for the relationship? Do they have concerns with the relationship? Because that's important. I know you like it. I know you love this person. I know you're into it. But what does your family think? People that have an outside objective and perspective, what do they think about the relationship? All right, so I could go on and on and on and on clearly about this topic, but hopefully those 5 concerns will give you something to think about. If you feel like God told you this is the one, or if the other person told you God told them you were the one, I want you to consider these 5 concerns and make sure that you're not ignoring some real things about the relationship. Make sure you are taking your time to really get to know somebody. Make sure that you are using wisdom, that you are being a good steward of the dating process, and you are listening to wise counsel around you in the process. If not, God told you may get you into trouble in a relationship. So I'm sure you have a ton of thoughts about this, whether you agree with me or you just think that I'm anti-God and God can't speak to nobody, even though I told you I don't believe that. Drop a comment. I'd love to continue this conversation. Maybe do a follow-up video if you have some real thoughts on this. If I can help you in any area of your relationship, would love to be part of your relationship journey. If you haven't already downloaded the free guide to intimacy, grab that below. And until next time, we'll see you right back here on RelationShots.